Hey everyone, and welcome to video 429 for the Legal Studies Guy. Still talking about the Constitution and how we change it. Quick quote today from Dolly Parton, the Queen of Country Music. Find out who you are, and then do it on purpose. So, really, again, honing in on that idea of what gives you joy, what fills up your cup, what makes you you, and then find time to do that. Like, do those things that you get in that flow state when you do them, that time loses all meaning, that you get enjoyment, happiness, that feeling of contentment out of. Um, and if we're not bringing those things into our schedule when we're trying to study for exams, if we're just focused on the things that are hard, we're not going to have as much success as we could. So really try and make sure as we're in the lead up to, final SACs, exams, etc., that you are prioritizing time to do the things. You're being purposeful with doing the things that bring you joy, that make you you. So today we are looking at 4.2.9, the requirement for the approval of the Commonwealth Houses of Parliament and a double majority in a referendum. So what do we need to actually do to pass a referendum? How do we change the Constitution? Last video, we looked at why we would change the Constitution. So the fundamental reasons for us seeking to do this. And now we're going to look into how we go about it. There's two skills here that aren't really aligned necessarily to this specific dot point. We're talking about analysing factors affecting the success of a referendum. So that's our next dot point, is the factors that affect the likely success of a referendum. But this will be required knowledge to help us do that skill in our next video. The fact that it is really difficult to achieve a double majority. And also that then feeds into this discussion around our ability to change the Constitution, the fact that it needs to go through Parliament first. So this content isn't necessarily directly linked to either of these skills, but it's content that is going to help us address those two skills in the future. So again, same slide from our last video. How do we amend the Constitution? And in simple terms, this is what the Australian Government Solicitor said back in 2010 in a document that they wrote. The Constitution provides a mechanism by which it can be altered, called a referendum, and this is section 128 of the Constitution. It's the last section of the Constitution, and I'll share you that section in a moment. Before there can be a change to the Constitution, a majority of electors must vote in favour of the change. So electors meaning a majority of people overall. Electors meaning people who vote in elections. So a majority have to vote for the change. And in addition, there must be a majority vote in a majority of states. That is 4 out of the 6 states. And it's a really common one kids get wrong. There are 6 states, not 8, not 7, not 5. There are 6 states, so a majority would be 4 of them, half plus 1. A little bit on like if there's a proposal that would diminish the power of a specific state or representation of a state, there must be a majority in that specific state. Before a matter can be subject to a referendum, so before you can even have a referendum, both houses of Parliament must pass the proposed law. So that's what we're talking about when we say the requirement for the approval of the Commonwealth Houses of Parliament and a double majority. So that's in section 128 of the Constitution, like I said, and this is what section 128 looks like. This is all of section 128, so starting here and all through here. So it's a very long section, and it starts, "This Constitution shall not be altered except in the following manner. The proposed law for the alteration thereof must be passed by an absolute majority of each house of the Parliament, and not less than 2, nor more than 6 months after its passage through both houses. The proposed law shall be submitted to each state and territory." So this is like the summary of the change. Hey, it has to get a majority from both. Majority of each house, and then 2 to 6 months later, it will go out to be voted on by all electors. Okay, everyone who is eligible to vote in the House of Reps. There's a little bit here around passing the Houses of Parliament. around, and I'm going to unpack this in a little bit more detail in a moment. If one house rejects it, the other house can pass it again, etc., and then it will still go to the electors with the approval of the Governor General, known as the deadlock provision. Once it's gone to the electors, what has to happen? A majority of the states, a majority of the electors must approve the change, and it must be approved by a majority over all. So this is really, really important. There's some provisions here around when women couldn't vote, because states were in charge of who could vote. So they did have a provision here that say if in South Australia women could vote, but in the other states it couldn't, then only 1/2 of the votes in South Australia would count towards the overall total. So that was a really important provision, because otherwise states would have extra say that they didn't otherwise deserve. If the referendum diminishes the proportion of representation of a state, then they have to have a majority in that state as well. Ultimately, all I want you to get out of this is Section 128 is wordy and complex, and it was written in the 1890s, as we've discussed before about the Constitution. So you're probably not going to read that and be like, yeah, I definitely understand how the Constitution's changed. What's going to be easier is if we simplify this. So how does a referendum pass? Well, let's just go through this step by step. As we know, Section 128, how to change the Constitution, is included in the last section of the Constitution. What has to happen first, before we even get to the people voting, is the change has to be written into what we call a Constitution Alteration Bill. So not an Act of Parliament yet, a proposed Act of Parliament. And it has to be passed by an absolute majority in both Houses of Parliament. So it has to pass through Parliament like a normal law, apart from the fact that it has to be an absolute majority. Now, an absolute majority is different to a simple majority, in that an absolute majority in the House of Reps is half the members, or a majority, half the members plus one, regardless of how many people are in the room. So sometimes you'll have a vote in the House of Reps, right? We'll use the House of Reps for an example. You'll have a vote in the House of Reps, and there might only be, 138 people in there. Now, what might cause there to only be 138 people in there? Well, someone might be on sick leave, and they might not be able to be there. Politicians have had illnesses before. They might have to have operations, and they can't be there. So it's just like someone being away sick from work. Generally, what will happen is if someone can't be there due to an illness, particularly something like long term, the other party will actually give them what's called a pair, which is the other party will also go, hey, we'll also not have one of our people there too. So we kind of even up the numbers. Sometimes when there's a vote going on, someone might be in another part of Parliament and they might not actually be in the chamber. There's a range of reasons why when there's a vote, there might only be 138 in there. That would mean we're only looking for a simple majority, which means we're only looking for half plus one. So to get something voted through, if there's only 138 people in there, you only need 70 votes, as opposed to the usual absolute majority, which is 150 divided by 2 plus 1, which is 76. So to change the Constitution, you need 76 votes in the House of Reps, always. And in the Senate, you need an absolute majority, which is 39, no matter what. Even if there's only 70 senators in the room, 6 of them away, you still need the number of yes votes as if everyone was present. So you need 39. That's what we mean by an absolute majority. So the Constitution Alteration Bill has to pass Parliament like normal. It has to go through both houses and it has to achieve an absolute majority. So for us to even have a referendum, like the referendum we had in 2023 on the Voice to Parliament, Parliament has to first approve it. Parliament has to first say, yes, I agree that the people are going to get to vote on this. Now, there is a special rule that if, say, the Senate votes no, and this has happened before, this happened in 1974, if the Senate votes no, the House of Reps can put forward the Constitution Alteration Bill again 3 months later. So if the Senate votes no, 3 months later, the Parliament can vote again. The House of Reps can vote again. And then the Governor-General can say, yep, I'm happy that the House of Reps has passed it twice, and I'm going to put it to the people anyway. So even if the Senate has rejected it, if the House of Reps passes it twice, the Governor-General can, or this thing called the deadlock provision can be implemented, and the question can be put to the people anyway. There was this plan in 1974 that they would water down the double majority provision. They tried to have a referendum where you would only need 3 states to have a majority rather than 4, which I'll talk about in a moment. And the Senate said no. The Senate refused to pass the Constitution Alteration Bill. But the House of Reps passed it twice, and the Governor-General said, yep, I'll give it over to the people. I'll let the people make a decision on whether they want that change. And ultimately, the people voted no on that one. So, first step, both houses of Parliament have to approve with an absolute majority the referendum, or one house twice in 3 months with the approval of the Governor-General. Then we go to the people. So between 2 or 6 months after it goes through Parliament, deadlock provision or normal, so in that nice 2 to 6 month window, because you've got to give people time to understand the changes proposed, but also you don't want it to go on for too long. The proposal is submitted to all the voters of Australia, every single person who is enrolled to vote in the House of Reps, and they're presented as a yes-no question. Do you approve of a change to the Constitution to? And the language might be to replace the Queen and the Governor-General as the head of state with a president elected by 2/3 majority of the House of Reps. Which was the 1999 question. Do you approve of a change of the Constitution to, introduce, I think last year's question was more or less introduce Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice to Parliament. And it's this yes-no question that has to achieve this thing called a double majority. What is a double majority? Well, it's just this. This is the exact wording that you want to use. Double majority is a vote of yes from a majority of voters in Australia, including territories. So we know a majority is half plus 1. So, and that's not like registered voters, that's of everyone who votes. So if 10 people vote, 6 would be a majority. If 100 people vote, 51 would be a majority. You have to get a majority of voters overall. So more than half the people who vote have to vote yes. And then this is the really hard part. A majority of voters in a majority of states. So that means you need to get over half the voters in 4 out of 6 states. And this is the hard part. I think there's been 5 referendums in Australia's history. So Australia's history, as we maybe don't know, is only 8 referendums have passed out of 45. There's been 5 of those 37 that failed that actually had a majority vote overall in Australia. More than 50% of people voted yes, but it didn't achieve a majority in 4 out of 6 states, usually because the smaller states voted no. There was actually one referendum that had a 62% yes vote, 62% yes overall, but it still only got a majority yes in 3 out of 6 states, so that referendum failed. Now, if you do achieve the double majority, if you get a majority overall and you get a majority in 4 out of 6 states, so again, a majority of voters in a majority of states, not a majority of voters in the states, a majority of voters in a majority of states. So you want to say majority, to talk about double majority, you want to say majority 3 times. A majority of voters, cut that majority out, that one there. A majority of voters in Australia and a majority of voters in a majority of states. If that happens, the Governor-General will then provide royal assent, and the wording of the Constitution will be changed. Again, incredibly difficult to do. So, got to go through both houses of Parliament. So you have to get approval from both houses of Parliament, or one, twice in 3 months. And then you have to get a majority of voters in a majority of states and a majority overall. So that's the wording you want to use. A majority of voters overall and a majority of voters in a majority of states. These are the two skills. We're going to talk about those more in your next videos that are actually targeted to this wording, factors and the ability of the Australian people, and looking at these two examples. But what it's important to understand is this is really difficult. So thinking about, the fact that before we even get to vote as a people, the Parliament have to pass it first. So that impacts our ability to change the Australian Constitution. Once we even get a vote, achieving the double majority is really difficult. Only 8 out of 45 successful. 5 of those have had a majority overall, but not a majority in a majority of states, including one that had a 62% yes vote, but still only achieved a majority in 3 out of 6 states. These are things that affect the success of a referendum. These are things that limit the ability of the Australian people to change the Constitution. So this content that we've just looked at will apply to these two skills. Can the Constitution be easily changed? Nice little Parliamentary Education Office resource that will help you look at that. But ultimately, if someone wanted to talk to you about the 2023 referendum or a future referendum, and they'd say, how do we change the Constitution? How did that come about? Hopefully you'll be able to really clearly tell them, well, first of all, Parliament has to agree to a referendum. They have to pass a bill through both houses. And then we have a yes-no vote that must achieve a double majority. And only that way can we change the Constitution. Happy studying, and I'll see you soon for video 4.2.